A massive draft horse arrived at his ranch by mistake, but what happened next left the old cowboy shaken to his core. He ordered a small working horse, but a towering giant stepped off the trailer instead, silent, scarred, and staring at him as if it already knew his story. In that moment, the old rancher sensed something was wrong, something missing, something waiting, and he had no idea that this mistake would unravel a truth powerful enough to change both of their lives forever. The delivery truck rumbled up the gravel road just after sunrise, its headlights cutting through the thin Montana mist that clung to the Bitterroot Valley like a memory that wouldn't fade. Elias Turner stepped out onto his porch, a coffee mug warming his hands, though he hadn't taken a sip. He wasn't expecting visitors. And he definitely wasn't expecting cargo. The driver hopped out, checked a clipboard, then glanced at Elias with the casual certainty of someone who believed paperwork never lied. "Got a horse for you, sir," he said. Before Elias could respond, the ramp clanged open, and the world seemed to tilt. A giant stepped out. The creature filled the frame of the truck like a moving mountain. Massive shoulders, dark coat shimmering with shades of coal and copper in the early light, legs thick as fence posts, hooves broad as dinner plates. He was far taller than any working horse Elias had owned, towering nearly 2 feet above a normal ranch gelding. The horse paused at the end of the ramp, surveying the ranch yard with the calm, heavy stillness of something that had seen hardship and survived it. Elias blinked slowly, feeling the ground under his boots shift. Not physically, but in the way a man senses his day has just changed course. "There's a mistake," he said quietly, but the driver only shrugged, handed him the paperwork, and made a beeline back to his cab. "Everything matches. Enjoy your horse." The engine groaned, tires spat gravel, and a trail of dust trailed the truck as it disappeared down the road. Within seconds, silence took back the valley. Elias stood there, alone with the mistake. He walked closer, each step cautious, but not fearful. The horse's eyes followed him. Large, dark, impossibly steady. There was no wildness in them, no confusion, only a knowing sort of patience, as if he'd been waiting for something, or someone, much longer than this short encounter. "You're not the one I ordered," Elias muttered. He had bought a small, inexpensive quarter horse from a local sale barn, something functional, something he could afford while the ranch limped along after years of drought. This beast wasn't functional. This was an animal from another world entirely. A draft horse of tremendous size and uncertain past. Elias rested a hand on the horse's neck. His fingers sank into a thick, coarse mane. The animal exhaled deeply, a warm gust that rose into the cool morning air. A faint scent of dust, hay, and something older, ash, drifted upward, catching him off guard. It stirred something quiet inside him, something he had tried hard not to name. "You've definitely taken a wrong turn," he said softly. But the horse did not move. He simply stood there, enormous and still, casting a broad shadow across Elias's boots. The valley breeze nudged at Elias's shirt, lifting the hem like a ghost tugging for attention. And for a moment, Elias felt the echo of another morning, another shadow much different than this one. A falling tree. A friend's voice cut short. Smoke rising into a red sky. The kind of memory no one talked about in polite company, not even when discussing life insurance or mortgage protection. Trauma was too delicate to name so plainly. Elias blinked hard and let the image fade. Today, was not a day for ghosts. He picked up the horse's lead rope, surprised that the massive animal followed without resistance. Each step sent a soft thud through the packed dirt, as if the earth slightly rearranged itself to bear his weight. Elias led him toward the old corral, the wooden rails worn smooth by decades of Montana weather. The morning sun was rising now, painting the valley in gold as thin clouds stretched like pale feathers above the peaks. Inside the corral, the horse circled once, head low, movements measured. Elias leaned on the rail, trying to make sense of the situation. Financially, this was impossible. Emotionally, it was something else. Something he couldn't quite touch. A soft nicker sounded from the horse. Elias looked up. "You're calm," he observed, "considering everything." It almost made the mistake feel intentional, though he knew that wasn't how life worked. Life rarely sent gifts to men who had lost their way. Another breeze swept the valley, carrying the faint scent of pine resin and river water. Elias straightened slowly, his bones protesting, and set the lead rope onto a post. "I'll figure out where you came from," he promised. "But you're only staying a day or two." The horse didn't react. He simply stood there, a silhouette against the growing sun, somehow too large for this little ranch and too quiet for his size. Elias turned toward the house, stepping off the corral rail. He paused, glancing back once more. The horse met his gaze with a depth that felt unsettlingly familiar, as if recognizing something in him. Loneliness, maybe, or the exhaustion of carrying more than one should. It was only a moment. But moments have a way of taking root. Elias walked back to the porch, the weight of the morning settling over him like Montana dust. Behind him, the giant horse lowered his head and exhaled again, a long, thoughtful breath that drifted through the air like a sign neither of them yet understood. And as Elias reached for the screen door, he couldn't help but feel it. This mistake wasn't leaving anytime soon. Elias stood on the porch longer than he meant to, the screen door half open behind him, letting the cool morning drift into the dim hallway of the house. The giant horse remained exactly where he'd left him, head lowered, breath rising in slow clouds that dissolved into the light. There was no urgency in the animal, no restlessness, no sense that he understood he wasn't meant to be here. Instead, his calm seemed to settle over the yard like a blanket, muting the usual creaks of wood and rustle of leaves. Elias exhaled slowly, then stepped inside to start the day. The house welcomed him with its familiar silence. It wasn't the quiet people brag about when they move to rural Montana. This was the heavier kind, the kind that sinks into floorboards and lingers between dishes drying in the rack. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed hesitant. Elias set his mug down and stared out the kitchen window at the horse, feeling something shift inside him. Uneasy, but not unwelcome. He didn't eat breakfast. Instead, he grabbed his hat, walked back outside, and approached the corral again. The horse raised his head just enough to acknowledge him. Those calm eyes followed Elias as he leaned on the fence, elbows resting on the old wood worn smooth by decades of weather and work. "You're too big for this place," Elias murmured. The horse blinked slowly, as if declining to comment. The sun climbed higher, warming the valley in soft increments, touching the distant cottonwoods along the river. Elias listened to the birds lifting from the branches, listened to the wind combing through the grass, listened to the quiet rhythm of the horse's breathing. Little by little, the sounds filled the space around him, not with noise, but with presence. He realized how long it had been since he'd spoken more than a few words in a day. Months, maybe. After leaving the wildfire crew, he'd lost whatever part of himself used to seek out conversations. Out here, it had been easy to let the world shrink until silence was the only companion he trusted. But standing beside this massive stranger of a horse, he felt something unfamiliar tug at him. A gentle urge to speak, not to the air, but to someone who might understand. "I didn't plan on you," Elias said quietly. "But I guess life rarely asks first." The horse shifted his weight, and the movement was surprisingly graceful for something so large. Elias watched the muscles ripple beneath the dark coat, watched the sun outline the ridge of his spine like a contour on a map. There was strength there, but also softness, an unlikely combination that reminded him of fire season, of men who were gentle until the moment came to be brave. A low rumble echoed briefly from the highway miles away. Elias barely noticed. His mind had wandered to the growing list of chores waiting for him: fixing the east fence line, clearing the irrigation ditch, calling the feed store to settle his overdue balance. Bills piled up like fallen leaves in autumn, easy to ignore for a while, impossible to overlook forever. His mortgage statement sat on the kitchen counter beneath an unopened envelope from the insurance office, and each time he passed by, the weight of them grew heavier. "You're one more thing I need to figure out," he said, "and I'm not exactly good at figuring things out these days." The horse flicked an ear at the sound of his voice. Elias chuckled softly, not a laugh, but the ghost of one, and stepped back from the fence. He circled around the corral, checking the rails, making sure nothing would give under the horse's size. To his surprise, the animal followed his movements with steady eyes, turning his head slowly each time Elias shifted position. There was an attentiveness in that gaze, a quiet curiosity that felt disarming. Elias paused. "You watching me or judging me?" A brief snort answered him, almost playful, and the unexpected sound pushed a small warmth into Elias's chest. He couldn't remember the last time an animal looked at him that way, like he was worth noticing, worth waiting for. By mid-morning, the valley had brightened fully. A thin ribbon of river shimmered through the trees, and the air carried the faint sweetness of wild mint. Elias fetched a bucket of water, hauling it across the yard with the slow determination of someone used to doing things alone. When he reached the corral, the horse stepped forward, lowering his massive head to drink. The movement stirred a breeze against Elias's shirt sleeve, warm and oddly reassuring. He leaned on the post again, taking in the scene, the mountains standing quiet in the distance, the sun warming the horse's coat to a deep, burnished glow, the small dust motes drifting like lost sparks through the air. It struck him that the ranch felt less empty than it had yesterday. Not fixed, not whole, but fuller somehow. "You're not staying," he reminded the horse softly. "I'll get this sorted out." But he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince. As the day unfolded, Elias found himself checking on the horse more often than necessary, refilling water, adjusting the shade, pulling a burr from the fence so it wouldn't catch the horse's mane. Each time, the animal watched him with quiet patience, as if learning his habits, memorizing the cadence of his footsteps. By late afternoon, Elias stepped away from the corral and headed toward the barn. The grass whispered around his boots. The sun hung low, turning the valley amber. And though he didn't turn around, he felt the horse watching him, the way a companion watches another, not with expectation, but with recognition. Inside the barn, Elias paused, resting a hand on the doorway. For the first time in a long while, the house behind him didn't feel so crushingly silent. Something else had entered his life. Something steady, breathing, real. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't mind it. He stepped inside, letting the barn door creak shut behind him. Outside, the horse shifted, settling into the shadows of the descending evening. The quiet between them no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them understood yet. The barn door hadn't fully swung open before Elias realized something was different. The valley, just moments earlier wrapped in the gentle drift of late afternoon, now felt taut, like a string pulled tight between two unseen hands. It took him a few seconds to understand why. The horse wasn't where he'd left him. Instead, the massive creature stood by the broken corner of the east fence, head lowered, studying a post that had given way under his weight. Elias muttered a soft curse under his breath, not from anger, but from resignation. The ranch had been fragile, long before the horse arrived. This visitor simply exposed the truth faster. He approached slowly, boots pressing into the damp earth. "You didn't mean to," he said, already certain of it. The horse looked up, eyes wide and almost apologetic. There was no chaos in his posture, only the bewildered calm of something too large for its surroundings, something trying hard not to break what little remained. Elias crouched by the fallen post, fingers brushing the splintered wood. The fence had been failing for years, patched with whatever scraps he could afford. It wouldn't have contained even a normal ranch gelding for long. This giant never stood a chance. As Elias lifted the post to assess the damage, he felt the horse's warm breath on the back of his neck. He didn't flinch. He only sighed. "You're going to cost me more than I have," he murmured, though there wasn't bitterness in his voice, only honesty. The ranch was barely holding together. The missed payments, the warning letters, the phone calls he let ring out. "Maybe I should have looked into mortgage refinance years ago," he said quietly, almost to himself. The words drifted into the air, carried off by the wind as if ashamed to linger. But the horse didn't move away. He stayed close. Too close, as though proximity alone could offer comfort. Elias stood and dusted his hands. The horse followed his movements with a slow turn of his head. Every motion, every shift of that massive body carried a gentleness that didn't match his size. Elias saw it again when the horse stepped back, careful, deliberate, avoiding a fallen bucket without being guided. It was the kind of awareness only animals with long training possessed. Not ranch training, something else. Something that nudged a question at the back of Elias's mind. "Where did you come from?" He didn't ask aloud. Some questions needed time. By the time he made it to the barn, the sun had dipped lower, stretching the valley into bands of burnt gold and cool blue. The hay inside was stacked in uneven bales, another thing he'd been meaning to get to. Elias grabbed one, hefting it over his shoulder, the rough twine cutting gently into his palm. He carried it back to the corral, where the horse watched him like a quiet guardian. The animal stepped toward him as he spread the hay. As the horse lowered his head to eat, Elias was struck by the contrast. The massive frame bending with unexpectedly soft grace, the long lashes catching the last light of day, the calm rhythm of chewing. The valley around them seemed to slow its breathing, as if matching the horse's pace. "You're gentle for something your size," Elias said. The horse flicked an ear, acknowledging him without pausing his meal. Elias leaned on the fence, letting the steady sound of crunching hay fill the empty pockets inside him. It was strange how quickly the presence of another living being could shift the atmosphere of a place. For months, the ranch had echoed with absence, of voices, of plans, of purpose. But now, standing beside this giant, Elias felt a presence strong enough to tilt the balance. Still, a heaviness clung to the edges of his thoughts. The ranch couldn't support an animal like this. Not financially, and not structurally. The broken fence was proof enough. Elias felt the weight of that truth pressing on his shoulders, mixing with other burdens he carried. The ghosts from wildfire seasons, the friends he couldn't save, the pieces of life he hadn't managed to rebuild. The horse raised his head suddenly, hay falling from his mouth. He turned, looking toward the river with an intensity that made Elias straighten. The breeze shifted. A few birds startled from the cottonwoods. The valley fell still again. "What is it?" Elias asked softly. The horse didn't answer, of course, but something in his posture suggested memory, like he was listening for a sound only he had heard before. Then, just as quickly, the tension eased, and he lowered his head once more. Elias didn't know what the moment meant. Not yet. But he filed it away in the corner of his mind, reserved for things that might matter later. Evening crept in, drawing a thin violet haze across the horizon. Elias checked the fence once more before heading back to the house. Halfway to the porch, he paused. He turned around. The horse was still watching him. Unmoving, expression unreadable, but somehow familiar. "You're too big for this place," Elias said again, voice gentler this time. "Too big for the life I have left." But as he spoke, he realized something else, something quieter, harder to ignore. Whether or not the horse belonged here, he had already changed the shape of Elias's days, already carved out a space in the silence, already become a shadow larger than his own. Elias stepped onto the porch, boots thudding softly on the wood. He opened the screen door and let it fall shut behind him. Through the window, he saw the horse exhale, a soft plume rising into the cooling night. For the first time in a long while, the sound of the ranch settling into darkness didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the world holding its breath, waiting for whatever came next. Night settled gently over the Bitterroot Valley, laying a blue hush across the fields. Elias stepped out of the house again, unable to shake the feeling that the quiet around him was changing shape. The kind of silence he'd grown used to, hollow, bottomless, lingering like smoke, felt different tonight. Softer somehow. The horse stood near the far side of the corral, framed by the first shy scatter of stars. He lifted his head when Elias approached, a slow, deliberate movement that felt like acknowledgement rather than curiosity. Elias rested his arms on the top rail of the fence. The wood was cool beneath his skin. The air carried the faint scent of river water and sage. For a long moment, neither he nor the horse moved, as if speaking in a language made only of breath and distance. "I don't know what to do with you," Elias said quietly. His voice sounded smaller than usual. Not weak, just honest. The horse blinked, a gesture so subtle yet felt so deeply seen that Elias felt the corners of his chest tighten. He wasn't accustomed to being witnessed. Not anymore. Not since the wildfire season that took more from him than he was ever prepared to lose. He didn't talk about that. To neighbors, to friends he no longer answered. Not even to himself if he could help it. But standing there under the thin moonlight, he felt the shape of that memory rise like a tide. And unexpectedly, it felt easier to bear with the horse nearby. The animal stepped closer, the ground trembling faintly under his weight. He stopped just shy of the fence, as if careful not to crowd the man who didn't quite know how to be close to anything anymore. Elias reached out, hesitated, then touched the horse's muzzle. Warm, real, present in a way that didn't demand anything back. It was startling how comforting that was. "You don't ask questions," Elias murmured. "That's a rare thing." The horse lowered his head, brushing Elias's arm with a softness that seemed impossible for such size. Elias closed his eyes for a moment. He didn't know if the gesture was comfort, curiosity, or simply habit. It didn't matter. Something inside him loosened anyway. The ranch was quiet in a way that had once felt threatening. But now, tonight, it felt like an old room finally lit by a single candle. A small light, but enough to see shapes again. Enough to sense what had been missing. Elias leaned against the fence, letting the stillness wrap around him. The horse remained at his side, unmoving except for the rise and fall of his breath. Occasionally, distant sounds drifted through the valley, the hoot of an owl, the muted rush of the river, the whisper of grass bending beneath the weight of evening. Each sound layered itself into a rhythm that felt almost like music. A simple one. A quiet one. The kind a man could rest inside if he let himself. He didn't notice how long he'd been standing there until the night grew colder and the stars brightened like scattered embers. The horse shifted his stance, but didn't leave. Elias exhaled softly. "I guess we're both stuck with each other for now." But even as he said it, he felt the truth bend slightly, as if a new meaning was beginning to form beneath the words. Stuck wasn't the right word. Not anymore. Not exactly. There was something else taking root. Something gentler. Not yet defined, but undeniably there. He finally turned back toward the house. The screen door creaked when he opened it, sounding louder than he remembered. Before stepping inside, he cast one more glance toward the corral. The horse had resumed his quiet vigil, head lowered, body outlined against the silver wash of starlight. An anchor in the dark. When Elias lay down that night, he didn't turn on the radio like he usually did. He didn't need the artificial noise to fill the gaps. For the first time in years, he let the silence remain unbroken. And in that silence, he felt something he had almost forgotten how to recognize, the faint outline of peace, forming slowly, as patient as the giant horse waiting for dawn. Sleep came gently. No dreams of fire. No voices calling out from memory. Only the soft echo of hooves shifting in the corral, steady and calm, like a heartbeat carried across the empty fields. By morning, the air would smell of dew, and the light would soften the world back into motion. But for now, there was only night, and quiet, and an unexpected companion breathing in the stillness with him, shaping the loneliness into something less sharp, less heavy, less his alone. The morning after that quiet night arrived gray and heavy, the kind of sky that presses down on a valley as if reminding it to stay humble. Elias stepped out onto the porch, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. A low hum vibrated through the air, distant thunder rolling over the Bitterroot Range. Summer storms came quickly here, gathering themselves from nothing and then spilling across the land without warning. He stood for a moment, listening. The storm felt far enough for now. Kodiak was already awake, standing near the gate as though he had been expecting Elias. The early light softened the edges of his massive frame, giving him an almost mythic silhouette against the rising clouds. Elias walked toward him, brushing a hand along the horse's neck. The air smelled different today. Charged, restless, ready to break. "You sense it too," Elias murmured. The horse turned his head slightly, as if acknowledging the shift. By mid-morning, the wind had picked up, rattling the loose tin on the old shed and swirling dust across the yard. Elias moved quickly, checking the gutters, securing the loose boards he'd been meaning to repair for months. The storm grew closer with each passing minute. The temperature dropped, and the valley dimmed beneath the spreading canvas of dark clouds. He took a moment to look toward the river. It ran low during most of the summer. But storms had a way of awakening old channels, turning docile trickles into sudden torrents. He told himself he should check the smaller runoff ditch behind the barn, not because it was urgent, but because working might keep his nerves anchored. Storms did that to him sometimes. Not all storms, only the ones that carried a certain sound in their thunder, like echoes of things he didn't want to remember. Kodiak followed him as he crossed the field, the wind tugging at the horse's mane, tossing the dark strands into the air. Elias didn't stop him. It was oddly reassuring, the way Kodiak's presence filled the space behind him, steady, unafraid, like a second heartbeat he hadn't realized he needed. When they reached the ditch, Elias crouched to inspect the water line. It was already rising, thin sheets of muddy water gathering where the ground dipped. He reached down, clearing debris with his hands, muttering under his breath about timing and luck. The wind answered him with a fresh gust. Leaves whipped past his face. Behind him, Kodiak shifted, hooves sinking into the softening ground. The horse wasn't uneasy, but he was attentive. Ears pricked, nostrils wide to the changing air. "We'll head back soon," Elias said. "Just want to make sure this doesn't overflow." Thunder cracked overhead, sudden and sharp. Elias flinched. Kodiak lifted his head but stayed calm. Rain arrived in thin needles at first, then thickened into a curtain that blurred the field into shades of gray. Elias wiped water from his eyes and kept clearing the runoff, telling himself it was just another storm, nothing more. But the ground betrayed him. Too soft, too slick. When he leaned forward to pull a branch free, his boot slid. His balance tipped. And the earth beneath him broke open. A shelf of mud gave way, dropping him down a short embankment. He hit the bottom hard, water splashing up into his face. For a moment he didn't move, stunned by the suddenness of it. The ditch was deeper here, the storm turning it into a shallow channel of rushing water. Not dangerous. Not yet. But he felt the ground shift again under him, a warning tremor that reminded him of the wildfire seasons. How quickly safe could become unsafe without asking permission. He tried to push himself up, but the wet clay stole his footing. His leg slid again. He caught himself on a root, breath quickening. The rain hammered the earth around him. Water trickled along the sides of the ditch, gathering speed. "Kodiak!" he called out, the name slipping free before he realized he'd spoken. The horse appeared above the embankment, dark against the storm, mane plastered to his neck. His ears flicked forward, his eyes fixed on Elias, not with fear, but with sharp, searching focus. "I'm fine," Elias muttered, though the words weren't true. He tried again to climb, but his boot sank deeper, mud gripping his ankle. Panic fluttered somewhere in his chest, not from the ditch, but from memories far older than this. The sound of rushing water mingled with remembered screams, with falling branches, with cracking earth. He closed his eyes for a second, steadying his breath. When he opened them, Kodiak was moving. The horse stepped carefully down the inclined slope, not recklessly, not blindly, but with the same thoughtfulness he had shown since the day he arrived. Hooves dug for stable ground. Muscles shifted beneath the soaked coat. He lowered himself until he stood directly beside Elias, close enough that the warmth of his body fought the chill of the storm. Elias reached up, fingers finding the thick mane. Kodiak didn't pull away. He braced himself, leaning just enough to offer support, without unbalancing either of them. Elias gritted his teeth, pushing with his good leg, letting the horse bear a portion of his weight. Inch by inch, breath by breath, they climbed back up the slippery embankment. When they reached the top, Elias slumped onto the wet grass, chest heaving. Kodiak stood over him like a sheltering wall, the rain streaking down his massive frame. Elias looked up at him, half laughing, half breathless. "You really don't know how to leave a man alone, do you?" The horse lowered his head, nudging Elias's shoulder gently. Lightning split the sky in the distance. The storm was far from over. But in that moment, mud on his hands, rain on his face, heart pounding, Elias felt something different from fear. He felt accompanied. He rose slowly, leaning on Kodiak for balance. Together, they made their way back across the trembling field. The storm spat sharp bursts of wind, but Elias no longer flinched at the thunder. Not with Kodiak beside him, steady as stone. By the time they reached the barn, the rain had grown heavier, lashing sideways across the yard. Elias pulled the doors open, guiding Kodiak inside. The barn felt warmer than he remembered, as if their arrival filled it with a new kind of heat, a quiet strength shared between them. Outside, the storm roared. Inside, for the briefest moment, everything felt still. The storm did not ease. It thickened into a wall of sound and water, rattling the barn roof like 1,000 frantic hands. Elias stood just inside the doorway, soaked to the bone, blinking rain from his eyelashes as he watched the sky churn. Kodiak stood close, but not crowding him, his presence solid and unshaken despite the chaos outside. Lightning flashed, briefly painting the horse's silhouette in sharp white, and Elias felt the echo of old memories tug at him. Wildfire seasons, where the world turned red instead of blue, where thunder was replaced by exploding timber. But this storm was water, not fire. And tonight, something kept those memories from climbing fully out of the shadows. "Just a storm," Elias whispered to himself. The words didn't steady him entirely, but the horse beside him did. The rain pummeled the fields with a force that made the earth tremble. Elias watched as sheets of water swept across the yard, erasing the lines between soil and puddle. He felt a familiar pull inside him, a sense of responsibility, old and stubborn. Part of him wanted to check the ditch again, make sure it hadn't overflowed, but his leg ached where the ground had given way earlier, and he knew pushing himself now would be foolish. Instead, he turned back into the barn, shutting the heavy wooden door behind them. The interior glowed with the dim light of a single lantern, its flickering flame throwing shadows across the beams. Kodiak stepped forward and shook himself, sending droplets scattering like tiny stars. Elias leaned against a support post, breathing in the warm scent of hay, leather, and horse, scents that softened the edges of the storm and the edges of his own thoughts. He sank onto an overturned bucket, pulling off his wet gloves. "That could have gone bad," he murmured. "Real bad." Kodiak shifted his weight, the gentle creak of the floorboards answering him. The horse lowered his head until his muzzle was inches from Elias's shoulder, breath warm and steady. Elias let the moment settle between them. It felt earned somehow, built through the quiet days and the slow trust neither had asked for, but both seemed to need. The barn shuddered as wind clawed at the walls. Outside, thunder rolled in long, angry waves. Elias rubbed his hands together, trying to shake off the lingering tremble in them. He wasn't afraid of storms, or so he always claimed. But the truth was, certain sounds, certain flashes, those things lived too close to the echoes he carried. He exhaled, long and uneven. "You knew I was in trouble," he said, looking up at Kodiak. "Didn't you?" The horse blinked, shifting his stance as if in disagreement with the idea that any other outcome had ever been possible. Elias chuckled softly. It felt strange to laugh, but it came easier tonight than it had in months. Lightning cracked again, brighter this time, illuminating the barn rafters and the dust drifting lazily in the air. The sound vibrated through the building, and Elias tensed despite himself. Kodiak moved instantly, stepping closer, placing himself between Elias and the storm, as though he could block out not only the rain, but every memory the thunder stirred. Elias rested a hand against the horse's broad chest. "You're something else," he whispered. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. It was impossible to tell. The storm had a way of bending time, turning it slow and heavy. Outside, the ground overflowed, small rivers forming where dirt paths once lay. The barn roof groaned but held. Elias finally stood, his clothes cold and stiff, and moved to check the animals, though there were few left. A couple of aging cows sheltered in the far stall, a barn cat tucked into the hay, and Kodiak, watching him with those deep, steady eyes that made the air feel less empty. At some point, the lantern's flame sputtered. Elias tapped it lightly, coaxing it back to life. Its warm glow brushed across Kodiak's coat, revealing a pattern of scars Elias hadn't noticed before. Thin lines, some older than others, some hidden beneath the thick mane. They were different from the mark on his shoulder. These looked like a history written in places no one ever asked about. "What did the world put you through?" Elias asked softly. The horse didn't answer, but his stillness spoke enough. It was the stillness of something that had endured, not merely survived. The kind of stillness that came after fire and fear and long nights, where the only thing left to do was hold your ground. Another boom of thunder shook the valley. The cows stirred uneasily. The barn cat darted deeper into the shadows. Elias felt his pulse spike, but Kodiak didn't flinch. The horse lifted his head and let out a low, rumbling nicker, soft, grounding, almost like reassurance. Elias stepped forward and pressed his forehead briefly against the horse's neck. He didn't know why he did it. It wasn't the kind of gesture he'd normally make. But exhaustion, gratitude, and the storm's relentless noise had carved something open inside him. And he let the moment happen. "You saved me," he whispered. And it was true. Not just from the ditch, from the silence that had wrapped itself around his life for far too long. From the weight he'd carried since the wildfire season that stole so much from him. The storm raged outside, but inside the barn there was a strange stillness. Two figures, one man and one horse, breathing in the same rhythm, sharing the same fragile pocket of peace carved out of chaos. Eventually, the thunder softened. The rain eased. The wind grew tired and slipped away into the dark. Elias didn't sleep that night. Neither did Kodiak. They stayed awake together, listening as the storm's fury gave way to quiet. By dawn, the valley would reveal the damage: fallen branches, flooded gullies, mud where grass once stood. But that was tomorrow's worry. Tonight, the barn held its breath with them, a shelter not just from the storm, but from everything it had stirred up. Morning crept into the valley with an exhausted kind of quiet, as if the land itself were catching its breath after the night's ordeal. The air smelled of wet earth and pine sap, a scent that always followed heavy storms. Elias pushed open the barn door, blinking against the pale first light. Kodiak stood exactly where he had stood for most of the night, close, steady, and alert. But now the horse lifted his head, as though welcoming the change in weather. "Looks like we made it," Elias said softly, stepping outside. The yard was a patchwork of puddles and torn-up soil. Branches lay scattered across the ground, the wind having carried them from God knows where. The runoff ditch behind the barn had carved itself deeper into the earth, a jagged wound left behind by the storm's temper. Elias surveyed the damage with a tired but grateful sigh. For all the mess, things could have been far worse. Kodiak followed him out, hooves sinking into the soft mud. His massive body cast a long shadow on the waterlogged ground, and for a moment Elias had to steady himself, not physically, but emotionally. It struck him how strange it was that this animal had arrived only days ago. Strange how quickly the horse's presence had become part of his days, part of his thoughts, part of the quiet spaces inside him he'd avoided for so long. He walked toward the fence line first, knowing it must have taken the worst of the storm. Kodiak stayed close behind, occasionally stopping to sniff fallen branches or nose at churned-up earth. Elias paused at a section where the top rail had splintered clean through. He crouched, running his hands along the fresh break. Not storm damage. Something else. "Lightning must have hit nearby," he murmured. But Kodiak seemed unusually interested in the broken rail, lowering his massive head to breathe along the shattered wood. Elias watched him quietly. The horse's posture stiffened. Ears forward, eyes alert, muscles bracing in a way Elias hadn't seen before. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. "What is it?" Elias asked. Kodiak didn't move. He stood as if listening to something only he could hear. Elias followed his gaze toward the far end of the property, where the storm had left deep grooves in the soil. In the faint morning stillness, he thought he heard something. A distant, metallic echo, soft but familiar. Not thunder, not wind. Something else. He turned back just in time to see Kodiak shift his weight and let out a low, deep sound, more rumble than whinny. It wasn't a reaction to the broken fence. It was memory, or the ghost of one. Elias straightened slowly. "You've heard that before." The horse looked at him, eyes wide, dark, and impossibly thoughtful. There was intelligence there. Too much, maybe. Something that hinted at training, discipline, and a past built on more than simply grazing in fields. Elias touched one of the old scars along Kodiak's shoulder. The horse didn't flinch, but he seemed to breathe differently, as if the touch brought something back. "How many storms have you been through?" Elias whispered. Thunder didn't scare Kodiak. Lightning didn't bother him. Water didn't spook him. Elias thought about last night. The careful steps, the instinctive rescue, the calmness under pressure. It was the way trained animals behaved during emergencies, animals whose lives were spent working alongside people in dangerous places, animals who knew how to save others. A faint unease settled deep in Elias's chest. Not a bad feeling, just a question forming, slowly and surely. "What were you?" he asked. The horse lowered his head, brushing his muzzle lightly against Elias's arm. A simple gesture, but it carried weight, as if acknowledging the question even without the answer. They spent hours walking the perimeter of the ranch that morning. Elias repaired what he could and marked what would need bigger fixes. Kodiak followed without complaint, stopping only when something caught his attention. A fallen pine branch, an overturned patch of earth, an abandoned piece of metal half buried in mud. Each time, he observed with the intensity of a creature remembering rather than discovering. When the sun rose higher, warming the valley back into motion, Elias headed for the riverbank. The water was faster now, swollen from the storm, but still manageable. Grass bowed under the weight of lingering raindrops, bending like rows of weary soldiers. Kodiak approached the bank slowly, ears twitching at the rush of water. Not with fear, with understanding. Elias watched him carefully. "You've crossed worse, haven't you?" The horse didn't react, but his stillness, his readiness, said more than any movement could. A breeze rolled off the river, cool and carrying the scent of distant pine. The wind lifted Elias's damp hair, brushing his face with a touch that felt strangely gentle. He found himself speaking without thinking, words slipping out like a confession. "You remind me of someone," he said quietly. "Someone who always knew what to do when everything went wrong." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The memory was heavy enough. A firefighter teammate who had steadied him through more than one close call, who had taught him to breathe through the noise, who hadn't survived the last catastrophic blaze. Elias felt the familiar ache rise in his chest, but didn't push it away. Not this time. The horse stepped closer, placing himself between Elias and the edge of the riverbank, blocking the wind. Elias swallowed hard. Emotion caught in his throat. Not sharp, but dull, like a bruise he'd carried too long. "You're trying to tell me something," Elias whispered. "I just don't know what." Kodiak turned his head slowly, meeting Elias's gaze with an expression he couldn't name. Not empathy, not intelligence, something deeper, like a bridge between two wounded histories. A hawk cried overhead, cutting through the stillness. The horse looked up briefly, then returned his attention to the man in front of him. Elias stepped back, suddenly aware of how close they were. He cleared his throat, trying to regain the ordinary rhythm of the morning. "Come on, let's get you some fresh water." But as they walked back toward the barn, Elias felt something undeniable threading itself into the day. The storm had revealed more than damage. It had unearthed a clue, quiet, buried, and impossible to ignore. And whatever Kodiak had lived before arriving here, it was beginning to rise to the surface. The afternoon sun pushed through the thinning clouds as if the storm had never happened, laying a pale warmth across the yard. The mud had begun to dry in uneven patches, and the air held that familiar after-rain clarity, the kind that made every sound carry farther, every color appear sharper. Elias tightened the last section of the repaired fence, brushing dirt from his hands. Kodiak stood near the barn, watching him with that same patient intensity he'd shown all morning. "You're sticking close these days," Elias said, half smiling. "Not that I'm complaining." The horse flicked an ear, and somehow even that small gesture felt thoughtful. It still amazed Elias how natural this quiet companionship had become. Not demanded, not forced, just quietly grown, like grass after a long winter. He walked toward the house, intending to change into clean clothes before tending to the rest of the chores. But as he reached the porch steps, a sound cut through the valley, out of place, too modern for the old ranch. Tires crunching on gravel, a vehicle slowing. Elias stopped. A black SUV pulled into the driveway, gleaming under the sun like a misplaced piece of a different world. It rolled to a stop beside the barn. For a moment, the ranch fell utterly silent, as if holding its breath. Elias felt an unexpected tightness climb into his chest. No one visited him unannounced. No one visited him at all. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out, mid-30s, dressed in sturdy work pants and a slate-gray jacket. Her hair was tied back neatly, and she carried a calmness that suggested she belonged to wild places more than cities. She scanned the property with thoughtful eyes before settling her gaze on Elias. "You must be Elias Turner," she called out, her voice steady but warm. He hesitated, then nodded. "Can I help you?" She walked toward him with measured steps, hands relaxed at her sides. "My name is Hannah Brooks. I'm with Wildlands Rescue." Elias had heard of them, a group known for working deep in the wilderness, aiding injured wildlife, and supporting firefighting operations when traditional teams couldn't reach certain areas. He frowned slightly, unsure what someone like her would want with a man like him. Before he could ask, Hannah's attention shifted past him, toward the barn. Or rather, toward the enormous animal emerging from it. Kodiak stepped into the sunlight, his coat drying into a burnished sheen. He paused when he spotted the woman, head lifting, ears pricked forward. Something in his posture sharpened, as though a thread inside him had been quietly pulled. Hannah drew a sharp breath. "Oh my God," she whispered. Elias turned toward the horse, suddenly uneasy. Kodiak held himself differently now, alert, listening, almost waiting. It was the same stance Elias had seen that morning near the broken fence, the same electric stillness. Hannah took a slow step forward. Where did you get him?" Elias explained in the simplest terms, the mistaken delivery, the unanswered calls, the days that followed. Hannah listened with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. When he finished, she didn't speak right away. Instead, she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small metal object. A whistle. Not an ordinary one. Elias recognized the shape. It was the kind used in wildfire response crews, the emergency signal carried by handlers working with rescue animals in dangerous terrain. Hannah lifted it to her lips and blew a sharp, short note. Kodiak reacted instantly. His head jerked up. His body tensed, but not in fear, in recognition. He took a step forward, hooves digging into the ground, eyes locked on the sound. Then he let out a deep, resonant call, a sound Elias had never heard from him before. A low, rising whinny that trembled with memory. Hannah's eyes filled. "It's him," she said, voice breaking. "It's really him." Elias stood frozen. "Him?" Hannah nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "We've been searching for him for 2 years. He disappeared during the Rattlesnake Ridge fire. Our team thought he didn't make it out." Elias blinked, stunned. "Kodiak worked fires?" "He was one of our best," she said. "A draft horse trained for deep terrain response. He hauled equipment into places vehicles couldn't reach. He carried injured crew out when smoke was too thick. He saved lives." She looked back at the horse, voice softening. "We lost sight of him when the fire changed direction. We searched every ridge, every drainage. Nothing." The world around Elias thinned. Wind moved through the grass. A hawk circled overhead. Somewhere behind him, the river murmured as if listening. "Kodiak," Hannah breathed. "You came back." The horse stepped forward and lowered his head until it brushed her shoulder. She placed her hands on either side of his muzzle, leaning into him the way someone might embrace an old friend. Tears streaked her cheeks, though she smiled through them. Elias looked away for a moment, giving the reunion its space. He felt something shift in his chest. Not jealousy, not loss, but the ache of watching someone reclaim a piece of themselves. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower. "So he belongs to your organization." "In a way," Hannah said, turning back to him. "But Kodiak isn't property. He's family. And we took his disappearance hard." She paused, studying Elias with a gaze that softened further. "You've taken good care of him. I can see that." Elias didn't answer. He wasn't sure he could. Hannah stepped closer. "We need to talk about what happens next." The word struck him harder than he expected. He looked at Kodiak, who was now watching him with an expression Elias couldn't decipher. Something between awareness and waiting. The valley felt suddenly too quiet, too still. "What happens next?" Elias repeated, barely above a whisper. Hannah's eyes gentled. "The decision might not be as simple as you think." For a long moment, Elias simply stood there, letting the weight of Hannah's words settle into the quiet. The air between them felt delicate, almost breakable, like one wrong breath might scatter everything they hadn't yet said. Kodiak remained still, poised in that attentive way of his, as if he too understood that something in the world had shifted, even if none of them had caught up to it yet. Hannah stepped aside, giving Elias space to absorb the truth. The sunlight fell across her jacket, glinting softly off the metal clasp of the whistle she still held. "I didn't come to take him without speaking to you first," she said gently. "This isn't an order. It's a conversation." Elias nodded, though the movement didn't feel like agreement. It felt more like acknowledgement of the inevitable. "He saved my life," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I know," Hannah replied. "That's what he does." They walked toward the barn together, Kodiak trailing close enough that Elias could feel the warmth of him at his back. The valley around them was bright now, rinsed clean by the storm. Grass sparkled with leftover rainlight. The river muttered in its swollen channel. For the first time since the horse had arrived, Elias felt the world moving faster than he could keep up. Inside the barn, they stopped near the open stall where hay still lay scattered from the night before. Hannah rested a hand on the stall door, studying its rough grain. Before he went missing, Kodiak had a record. She paused, searching for the right word. A reputation, really. He was the horse you wanted with you when everything went wrong. Elias looked at Kodiak. The horse lowered his head, as if the words brushed against an old memory. "He's been through a lot," Elias murmured. "So have you," Hannah said. The softness in her voice startled him. She looked at him not with pity, but with understanding. The kind that comes from someone who'd stood close to danger, who'd listened to both fire and silence. He swallowed. "I can't imagine letting him go." "You might not have to," she said. Elias turned toward her fully now. "What do you mean?" Hannah took a breath, steadying herself. "Our organization has grown since Kodiak disappeared. We've expanded rescue operations, medical rehabilitation, and training facilities. But we're at capacity. We've been searching for a satellite location, somewhere quieter, farther from traffic, closer to open land." Her gaze swept the barn, the fields beyond it, the mountains standing guard at the valley's edge. "This place," she continued, "has exactly what we need." Elias stared at her, unsure he understood. Hannah stepped closer, her expression earnest. "We want to lease a portion of your land. Use it for a recovery outpost, for injured rescue horses, retired service animals, animals that need time and quiet." She hesitated. "And we'd like you to be here with them, as a caretaker, a partner, really." Elias blinked. Of all the things he expected her to say, this wasn't even in the realm of possibility. "Me? You have what these animals need," Hannah said simply. "Patience, steadiness, respect. Kodiak bonded with you for a reason." The words hit him somewhere deep and unguarded. It had been a long time since anyone had said he was what someone, or something, needed. Hannah shifted, giving him space to breathe. "And there's more. Kodiak will need to return to our main center for a short time. Medical checks, updated training evaluation, that kind of thing. But once he completes that..." She glanced at the horse, then back at Elias with a small smile. "He can come back here. To stay. If that's what you want." Elias felt the world steady beneath him, as if the barn itself settled deeper into the earth. He looked at Kodiak, who stepped forward and pressed his forehead gently to Elias's shoulder, as if sealing the truth of Hannah's words. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, letting that warmth soak into him. "For months," he said softly, "I've been trying to figure out how to keep this place alive. I thought I was supposed to do it alone, thought that was the only way." "Maybe it doesn't have to be," Hannah replied. Elias looked around the barn, the worn beams, the patched walls, the scars of storms and years and quiet struggles. "It's not much," he whispered. "It doesn't need to be," she said. "It just needs to be here. And so do you." Outside, a breeze drifted through the open doorway, carrying the crisp scent of wet soil and distant pine. The air held a softness that made the moment feel almost sacred. Elias stepped away from Kodiak, walking toward the threshold of the barn. Hannah followed, though she kept a respectful distance. "I don't want any charity," Elias said. "This isn't charity," she replied firmly. "It's partnership. And it's earned." He stood there, absorbing every word, absorbing the possibility, absorbing the idea that maybe life wasn't finished offering him places to belong. Hannah spoke again, quieter now. "Kodiak found his way back to the world. It seems only right that the world offers something back to you too." Elias let the words settle, let them take shape inside him. When he finally turned back toward her, there was something in his face that hadn't been there in a very long time. A kind of trembling certainty, fragile but real. He nodded. "I'll do it." For a moment, Hannah didn't speak. She just smiled, a smile warm enough to feel like dawn breaking inside a long night. Kodiak snorted softly behind them, as if adding his own approval. Elias lifted a hand to the horse's thick mane, fingers threading into the coarse warmth. "Looks like we're not done yet," he murmured. The valley answered with a hush of wind, carrying away the last shadows of uncertainty. And for the first time in years, Elias felt something rising in him that he almost didn't recognize. The slow, steady beginning of hope. The morning Kodiak left for Oregon was quieter than Elias expected. No dramatic farewell, no mournful cries, just a soft gray sky stretched across the valley and the muted hum of the transport truck idling by the barn. Kodiak stepped into the trailer without hesitation, pausing only once to look back at Elias. The moment held steady, warm despite the chill in the air, like two old friends acknowledging a truth larger than either of them. Then the ramp lifted, the latch clicked, and the truck rolled down the long gravel road, carrying the horse away until he became nothing more than a dark shape, swallowed by distance. Elias stood in the doorway long after the dust settled. The yard felt different. Not empty, just waiting. He rubbed his hands together, unsure what to do with the unfamiliar stillness. For the first time in months, there was no heavy breathing behind him, no shadow large enough to cover half the ground he walked. The valley felt bigger without Kodiak, and somehow smaller too. He spent the first few days repairing what winter, storms, and time had strained, clearing debris from the ditch, mending the splintered rails, brushing the barn floor until it looked almost new. He told himself he was preparing for the rescue horses that would soon arrive, but deep down he knew he was simply keeping his hands busy, giving his heart time to adjust to a silence that no longer hurt, but wasn't comfortable yet. The evenings were the hardest. He found himself stepping onto the porch out of habit, expecting to see a massive silhouette by the fence. Instead, the field stretched out flat and pale beneath the setting sun, undisturbed. Hannah visited a few times during that first week, bringing paperwork, updates, and a sense of calm that settled into the house like a welcome guest. She spoke about the expansion plans, the horses that would come, the volunteers who might join later in the season. Elias listened, nodded, and tried to imagine the future she described. It felt close and far at the same time, like a place he recognized from dreams, but had never truly stood in. One afternoon, as they walked the property line together, Hannah paused and glanced at him. "You've done well here," she said. "Better than you think." Elias looked at the ground, unsure how to respond. Compliments had become strangers to him. Hannah didn't push. She simply let the words linger in the air between them until they settled naturally into the quiet. Days passed. The barn grew fuller. 2 injured rescue horses arrived first, one with a torn ligament, the other recovering from smoke inhalation. They were quiet, gentle animals, carrying their own burdens from the world beyond the valley. Elias found himself speaking to them the way he once spoke to Kodiak, calm, steady words that didn't require answers. Slowly, the ranch shifted into something new. Not the cattle operation it once was, not the lonely refuge it had become, but something in between, a place meant to heal instead of simply endure. But even as life reorganized itself, Elias felt a subtle restlessness beneath everything. The ranch hummed with purpose now, yet a small part of him remained unanchored, waiting for something he couldn't quite name. It crept into his mornings and slipped into his evenings, that quiet tug. Then, one early morning near the end of spring, he heard it, hooves on the gravel road. Not hurried, not distressed, just steady. He stepped onto the porch, heart lifting in a slow, uncertain arc. A transport truck pulled into the driveway, familiar in shape and sound. Hannah stepped out of the passenger seat, waving when she saw him. Her smile held a warmth that made the morning feel brighter. "They cleared him faster than expected," she called out. Elias didn't answer. He didn't move. He simply stood there, as the ramp lowered and a massive shape appeared inside the trailer. Dark coat gleaming in the early light, mane falling in thick strands, frame as solid and sure as the mountains beyond the fence. Kodiak stepped down with the slow confidence of a creature who understood exactly where he was going. Elias felt something break open inside him, not painfully, but like a door that had been stuck for years finally giving way. He walked forward, each step gathering the weight of months of fear, gratitude, and longing into something that felt dangerously close to joy. The horse stopped in front of him, lowering his head until it brushed Elias's chest. Warmth surged through him, familiar and grounding. He pressed his forehead against Kodiak's neck, breathing in the earthy scent of dust, hay, and something like home. "You came back," Elias whispered. Kodiak's breath rumbled softly against him, as if answering in a language older than words. Hannah stood a few steps away, watching with quiet satisfaction. "He remembered the way," she said softly. "Even when we were loading him, he kept looking northeast. Toward here." Elias didn't look up. He couldn't. Not yet. The moment was too full, too sacred. When he finally stepped back, Kodiak followed him, nudging his shoulder with a gentle insistence that said everything the horse could not. They walked the property together, past that repaired fence, past the riverbank where Elias had once clung to slippery earth, past the barn where the storm had pinned them inside with thunder and breath and unspoken fear. The valley carried the same wind, the same open sky, but everything felt transformed. Because they were walking it together again. Later that evening, as the sun sank low and cast the fields in deep gold, Elias stood on the porch with Kodiak beside him, watching the two rescue horses grazing peacefully. The scene felt impossibly simple and impossibly profound all at once. For years he had lived in the fragments of what had been. Now, for the first time, he felt the shape of what could be, quiet, steady, and wholly his. He rested a hand on Kodiak's neck. "We belong here," he said softly. The valley didn't answer with wind or bird song or distant river murmur. It answered with a kind of stillness, one that held everything. The storms, the losses, the long nights, the unexpected arrivals. And as the sky dimmed, Elias felt it settle into him, gentle and complete. The mistake had found its meaning. The wandering had found its home. And the horse, who wasn't supposed to be here, was exactly where he was meant to stay. If this story touched something quiet in you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Even a single sentence means more than you think. And if you'd like to walk with me through more stories like this one, feel free to subscribe. There's always another moment, another connection, another healing waiting in the next story.